Okay, everyone, thank you for coming. Welcome. Our next press conference is an update on the results from the Chicxulub Impact Crater Drilling Expedition. Our participants are Sean Gulick, Joanna Morgan, Tim Bralower, and Philippe Claeys. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks everybody for coming. So this is basically a release on what we've learned so far with the cores that we just drilled in the Chicxulub Impact Crater in the offshore. Without going any further, we have to acknowledge how this occurred. So this is part of the International Ocean Discovery Program with co-funding by the International Continental Scientific Drilling Project. It was managed by the European Consortium of Ocean Research Drilling. And we had lots of partners both in industry and in Mexico that helped us make this happen. The four people representing the very large science party that are here are in bold at the bottom. And what we wanted to do is basically kind of highlight the aspect of impact cratering as in terms of its influence on life. So fundamentally, impact cratering alters planetary surfaces and crust. And in the case of Earth, we have a number of pieces of information about how it looks like it also has both positive and negative effects on life. So what you see here is the Schrodinger basin on the moon, the lunar far side. It's actually overprinted by a gravity map where the darker colors are basically representing lower densities and the redder colors, if you will, are representing higher densities. And so you can see the basin nicely outlined. And you notice that there's this ring of hills that is known as a peak ring that surrounds the center. And what we drilled at Chicxulub on Earth was one of these peak rings where it's buried off the coast of Mexico. So why drill Chicxulub? First of all, it's the best preserved large impact crater on Earth. It is only 66 million years old and was rapidly buried by the last 66 million years of limestones, has not been affected by erosion or tectonics, and thus we have this perfectly preserved large impact crater. So what you see here is the approximate location of the crater. It's about 200 kilometers across. This is a gravity map that's kind of been enhanced horizontally. So you can see here the coast of the Yucatan, the inner ring of the crater, and these anomalies right here are in fact this buried peak ring, just like we saw on that lunar crater. This is then a seismic line cutting right through here on this white line. So that's basically, if you want to think of it as depth on the left, and as we move towards the center of the crater, so this is radial distance from the center of the crater, and you can see basically that there's a series of faults that make up the rings, a stepping downwards into the crater floor, and there's this bump here, which is in fact that peak ring, and that is what we chose to drill into. It is the only terrestrial crater on Earth with an unequivocal peak ring, and because it's an excellent place to study the way that life recovered within the impact crater after the mass extinction event. So speaking of the mass extinction event, what do we think actually happened? The latest modeling suggests it's a 14-kilometer diameter asteroid impacted the Yucatan approximately 65.5 or 66 million years ago. Not only did the charismatic megafauna, as we like to say, the dinosaurs and the large reptiles and things like that, and ammonites go extinct, but in fact 75% of all life went extinct. With even greater percentages in the surface ocean, for instance, something as much as 90% in many cases, versus less in other parts of the ecosystem. And interestingly enough, anything larger than about 25 kilograms went extinct. Amongst the survivors are obviously mammals. Evolution happens, and that led to the science party, so we found that useful. So what we know about this mass extinction event is from the global boundary layer. So everywhere there is a preserved end of the Cretaceous, start of the Paleogene, everywhere we have rocks of about 66 million years old, we have at least a clay layer that represents the fallout from the atmosphere at the time of the impact. And if you look at places like deep sea cores, we actually have slightly expanded versions of these Cretaceous Paleogene boundary, or KPG boundary layers. And so you can see, for instance, in this sort of famous IODP core off of southeast United States, or ODP, I should say, you can see how there was Cretaceous fauna here. In this case, these are foraminifera, which is zooplankton living in the upper portion of the ocean. You can see the boundary event itself that includes things like condensates or tektites that fell from the sky, and you can find a thin settling layer at the top, which is where you'd find something like the iridium and dust and so on that fell out of the atmosphere. And then you see life coming back into a very different sort of ecosystem. I want to highlight what this looks like inside the crater. If you look on more terrestrial sites, this is actually in Texas, you can see evidence of the high energy kind of events that would occur if you're a little bit closer to the impact and nearer to the ocean, so or on the coasts. So you can see tsunami layers stacked on top of each other that came up the Intercontinental Seaway and reached what is now Texas. So there are a number of potential killing mechanisms that we'd like to get a better handle on in terms of why 75% of life went extinct and why places like the surface ocean were impacted greater. There's the potential of just simply the ejecta going through the atmosphere and raining back down to Earth is a frictional heating event and would have actually heated up the surface of the Earth, causing potentially scattered or worldwide wildfires, being one of the potential kill mechanisms. But there's also the dust that can stay up there. There's the finer particles or potentially even aerosols that can stay up in the atmosphere for months or even years, impeding sunlight and therefore reducing the effectiveness of photosynthesis, being one of the underpinnings of our ecosystems on Earth. So that's sort of that, if you will, the nuclear winter scenario. There's also the possibility of the release of volatiles out of the impact crater into the atmosphere, including both carbon dioxide that can then be drawn down into the ocean and cause ocean acidification, or maybe sulfate combining with water to make sulfate aerosols that can be an acid rain. So there's a couple of different mechanisms that are worth testing that might imply ocean acidification as an important element. And then lastly, there's this possibility of metal loading, of metal toxicity, if you will, from the impact.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about what we drilled. I'm going to talk about the objectives of drilling and where we've got to date. This shows where the hole was, this black solid line here. So we drilled into this funny thing called the peak ring that Sean's just described, this ring of mountains in the middle of the impact basin. So why did we do that? Well, partly we were trying to work out how a large crater's formed, so how our peak rings formed in these large craters. That'll help us constrain things like the impact energy. It'll help us constrain sort of the pollutants that were put in around the world at this time that made this impact so catastrophic. And we also wanted to understand, we had some clues about this peak ring being a bit strange. So we didn't quite know where it was from. We thought it might be from quite deep. And there was evidence that from geophysical data that this peak ring might be formed from very unusual rocks, so very fractured, very porous rocks. So apart from understanding how peak rings are formed, we were quite curious as to, are these fractured rocks, could they be habitats for life? We know at this time from other drill holes that the ocean was probably quite toxic because we have a hot impact melt rocks. We have an ocean on top of the crater, so there would have been quite vigorous hydrothermal processes. So potentially these peak ring rocks with all their porosity could be habitats for sort of some unusual life, so something like chemosynthetic life. So we've got, in terms of where we've got to, we've recently published a paper about peak ring formation in science, so we sort of first order-wise answered that question. And in terms of press releases, we've also talked a little bit about habitats for life. So as I show you, we have got some evidence of a living deep biosphere actually in the impact crater rocks. But what's new today in this press release, and Tim and Philippe will tell you more about this, is we're going to talk about the transition from impact crater rocks to the earliest sediments. So the sediments put on top of that covered the impact crater. They're going to tell us about the environmental after the impact and how life recovered. I'm blind. Sorry, I need my glasses. So this is just to show you what it was like offshore and onshore. So here you can see the rig. It's an absolutely tiny rig. There's about 50 of us on that rig. Conditions were, it's quite cozy. We lived in in rooms with beds. So there was 6 to a room with bunk beds. This is how we get onto the rig. The Mexicans call this the widow's basket, which is not very encouraging when you get on it. And here, this is the sort of main scientific walkway. So this is where we spent, essentially, some of us spent 2 weeks offshore, and some of us spent sort of 6 to 8 weeks. So in these blue containers here, that's where we did our preliminary analyses. The rig floor is behind here. It's quite a dangerous place to be. It's very noisy. And this is us sort of sitting, waiting for the next core to arrive on deck. So we spent 2 months drilling in April and in March and April, and then we spent another month in Germany this September, October. So you can see us now sort of doing sort of more focused analyses. This is the sampling group, choosing samples for all the science party members. The whole science party attended this part of the expedition. And this is the visual core description. So you can see everybody's there looking at the core. We've now cut the core in half. We can see it have good visibility of the core. So we can say what lithologies, what minerals, what structures, and do a really good description of the core. Apart from these, we were also doing lots of other analyses, petrophysical analyses, geochemical analyses. Philippe's going to talk about that. Paleontological analyses, which Tim's going to talk about, to get us the right date and tell us something about the environmental conditions post-impact. So this is part of the paper published in Science about 3 weeks ago. So what did we drill when we drilled through this peak ring? We basically drilled a whole lot of granitic basement rock covered by impact melt and impact breccias. And it's a really, really, as we expected, very, very unusual granitic basement. So it's got this it's fractured from sort of all scales, from sort of the macro scale to the micro scale. So it's got very high porosity, very sort of low density. So it's a very unusual basement. And it's like that because it's essentially been very heavily shocked, and it's moved many kilometers, tens of kilometers during the formation of this peak ring. What we're going to focus on later is on the recovery. So we were incredibly fortunate. I think we sort of drilled in a sort of little dip here. So we were lucky to recover the earliest Danian sediment, so the earliest life immediately after the impact. So that was quite exciting, and Philippe and Tim will talk about this transition here. So as I mentioned, we've got a paper talking about peak ring formation. That was published in Science 3 weeks ago. What you're seeing here is a numerical simulation of the peak ring formation. So the rocks that form the peak ring are basically these coloured blue here. You can see they get pushed down and out more than 10 kilometres, then they move in and upwards more than 10 kilometres. And this is their final collapse to their final position to form a peak ring. So there was 2 models for peak ring formation we were testing between the 2, and we've essentially sorted that out. We've got the one that was much more dramatic. The alternative model was quite sedate. So we've got this sort of dynamic collapse model of peak ring formation that you can see here. And as I said, that's important because it's going to help us constrain impact energy. It's going to help us constrain volume of pollutants. And it's also going to help us understand large impacts on other planetary bodies. So now that we understand how large impact craters are formed, they're going to help inform us about the near surface of other planets. So as I mentioned, the second objective was trying to understand, was this peak ring a habitat? So this here shows hydrothermal, a model of hydrothermal circulation in a peak ring similar to the Chicxulub crater. So we've got very, very hot rocks here. We've got an ocean covering the peak ring, and we've got predicted quite significant hydrothermal circulation within the peak ring, within these very porous rocks. So why do we think, so that could make these peak ring rocks incredibly sterile. In fact, we've got toxic metals being circulated through the peak ring. Similarly, it could make the ocean above quite sterile, and that's what we might expect. The alternative is actually there's life able to take advantage of these pore spaces and these nutrients. So why might there be life in the crater now? So we've got evidence at other craters. This is Chesapeake, where we do see enhanced cell counts. So evidence of a modern deep biosphere, sort of microbes actually currently living in the crater rocks. So this picture shows on the right here shows you some rocks in the impactites, the crater rocks, where you can see some hydrothermal minerals, and you see hydrothermal mineralization all the way through the whole of the peak ring rocks. So we do have these very active hydrothermal processes. And then the other picture shows cell counts through the crater rocks. I'm afraid I've taken off the scales there because this is hopefully going to form the next Nature or Science paper. So we've got high cell counts within the crater rocks, showing that there is a modern deep biosphere within the crater. At the moment, we also picked up DNA in those crater rocks, and what's happening now is that DNA is being cultured to amplify the signal, which takes about 6 months, so more or less now in the next month, we'll be looking at that to do some DNA sequencing to help us understand what life is currently occupying the crater.
So I'm going to talk really briefly about our third objective, which is to investigate the causes of the mass extinction and the mechanisms of the recovery at ground zero. And so this was actually a very good place to investigate the causes of the mass extinction, because the environmental triggers for this mass extinction would have been generated right here within the crater. In addition, we're very curious as to whether the location of ground zero, with all of the effects that Joe and Sean have talked about, such as ocean acidification and metal toxicity, would have delayed the recovery. So this is a very prime place for us to actually drill. And actually thinking a little bit about that animation that Joe ran a couple of slides ago, to me it's incredible with what you'll see in the next few slides that we recovered such a apparently complete section of the immediate aftermath of the impact. Okay. Let me go to the next slide here. Is it this one? Okay, got it. Yeah, I need my glasses. So in this slide here, I show the sequence that we have of the immediate aftermath of the mass extinction. And what we see here are these levels here, which are these tsunami beds over here. And they're sands that contain tektites. And these are overlain by this settling layer here, which is what I'll be talking quite a bit about. It's 80 centimeters thick. And we think that this settling layer was deposited in days to years after the impact itself. And what we think happened is that the tsunamis that deposited this layer gradually waned in the days after the impact. And the settling layer then was the suspended material that settled out. And so we'll be focusing quite a bit on this layer here. And then after that, life recovered. And this limestone here, which took thousands to millions of years to be deposited, represents the recovery of life that we're interested in this third objective. Oops, I think I need to go back, actually. Yep. It looks like we should have had this one here. All right. So in this slide, what I'm going to show you is the two groups of phytoplankton that we have, the two groups of plankton that we have studied in our preliminary research. The first group of plankton on this side are the nanoplankton, and these are autotrophs. They're little protists that make a beautiful shell out of the mineral calcium carbonate or calcite. On the top side here, we see Cretaceous nanoplankton. You can see they're quite diverse and they're large. On the bottom side, you can see Paleocene nanoplankton. They're much smaller and they're much less diverse. These are autotrophic, they're phytoplankton. On this side here, we see Cretaceous foraminifera. These are zooplankton that also make a shell out of calcium carbonate calcite, but they're the group that are one step up the food chain from this group. They're the consumers. They're still protists, though, and they make beautiful shells out of calcium carbonate. And this slide here is the Paleocene foraminifera that you can see in this slide here, much smaller, much lower diversity, much higher dominance. So we have the two groups of plankton, and these are both groups that suffered about 95% extinction at the boundary. I also wanted you to notice, I'm going to come back to what Sean just said, this is a section of the Cretaceous tertiary boundary that was recovered by the ocean drilling program in the late 1990s off the coast of Florida. And you can see here the Cretaceous limestone, and then we have this tektite layer, which is green in color. This was likely deposited by some sort of a submarine gravity flow. And then overlying this is a thin settling layer. This is the layer that likely contains the Iridium anomaly, and it's the layer that we think fell out from the suspension after the tsunami and gravity flows waned, and this is overlain by the earliest tertiary. So it was a great surprise and actually a lot of glee that we have recovered what we think is a very expanded layer of the settling history from the wake of the tsunami in the crater itself. And this, we think, is a very complete section that likely encompasses days to hundreds of years after the impact. And so what we're in the process of doing is looking at a very detailed sequence of samples within this settling unit every centimeter or so to observe the recovery of life after this impact event. Now, typically in units like this, in these high energy units around the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, we typically find Cretaceous plankton, both foraminifera and calcareous nanoplankton. These are nanoplankton that have been what we call reworked or resuspended by things like gravity flow, submarine avalanches, and tsunamis. So there are things that existed in the crater walls or on the escarpments around the Gulf of Mexico, which then collapsed, and then these fossils were resuspended. So typically we find these things, and in fact we have found reworked Cretaceous foraminifera and nanoplankton within this settling layer. But as we looked further, what we found was, in addition to these reworked specimens, we found these specimens. These are disaster nanoplankton, and there are two species that we found, Thoracosphera and Barudosphera. These are what we call stress species or disaster species. These are found in great abundances above the mass extinction. At a time when the ocean was toxic, not very suitable for life, these are species that were able to tolerate these stressful conditions. And what we found in fairly low abundances, but we have found them in this settling unit, are these stress taxa. And we think that this is evidence for primary life within the crater after the mass extinction. So these things were growing in the surface of the ocean, in the crater, after the mass extinction, and they fell down to the bottom and were combined with these reworked fossils in addition to them. And then moving on, we found this little guy here, which is a species which is known to be a survivor, so it's nothing new. It's a species called Cyclogellosphera reinhardti, and it is found in the Cretaceous. It's very, very rare in the Cretaceous, and then it becomes much more abundant in the Paleocene above the mass extinction event. So we have found this guy in the settling layer, and we also believe that that's evidence that we have primary life within the crater after the mass extinction. So in the months to come, we are going to be gleaning these samples for additional evidence for other species that we believe were living in the ocean and living within the crater after the event. So in the next slide, I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about the recovery, which is encompassed by this unit here. This is the limestone that we think took thousands to millions of years to be deposited. And this slide here from Chris Lowry, who is unable to be here today, shows on the left side a sample that's about 30,000 years post-impact, so it's at the base of that white layer, the limestone, and then a slide that's several cores above, maybe 3 or 4 meters above this layer. So what we see on the left side are very small foraminifera, and these, again, disaster species. This is Thoracosphaera, this is one of these stress species, a planktonic foram and a nanofossil. And we're interpreting this to indicate that the foraminifera recovered more rapidly than the nanoplankton. And this is actually known from elsewhere. Not quite sure that we understand it, but it's interesting that we see this within the crater as well. On this side, we see beautifully preserved large foraminifera from several millions of years. And our goal is to investigate the entire interval within the recovery to see how long it took the nanoplankton to recover and whether this recovery was retarded within the crater. And so that's one of our primary objectives for the months to come. And with this, I'm going to hand over to Philippe.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to finish with one of the key elements here. 40 years ago, the whole story of the dinosaurs being killed by a meteorite impact started because iridium was found at the Cretaceous tertiary boundary. So every time you look at Chicxulub, you look at the extinction, you look at Cretaceous tertiary boundary, you ask, where's the iridium? And this is precisely what we're going to try to do, is to find the iridium anomaly right here in this very important core. We've recovered many, many cores. They're all great, but this is really the mother of all cores, I would say. And you see, okay, the analysis of platinum group element. Iridium is one of the platinum group element. This is brought into Earth by the meteorite. It's a very tedious and complex procedure. So we try to work quickly, and instead of measuring iridium, we decided to measure nickel. Because nickel is also, just like iridium, just like the platinum group element, what we call a siderophile element. It's an element that loves to make chemical bonds with iron. That's why on Earth, all the iridium is in the core. Okay, we don't have any at the surface. So the iridium that is brought in by the meteorite can be approximated by measuring the concentration in nickel. And that is what you see here. Okay, this is very preliminary, but you see here at the very bottom right there, we are in the crater breccia, in the suevite. And if we go up a little bit, you see all of a sudden we have an increase in the concentration of nickel. Then it goes back down. It's kind of changing a little bit, and there seems to be another tiny little peak here. So what we see between this point and that point here is extremely interesting, because this is the deposition of the ejecta material. This is the deposition of, in part, some of the material coming from the meteorite right at ground zero, at the very top of this peak ring. You remember the Schrödinger basin. You have to remember, the little movie, the animation. You see all this granite material coming from deep, moving in every direction before it ends up at the surface. On top of that, okay, we're in this Gulf of Mexico. You have tsunami going in every direction, and it looks like one of the first things to settle might be this ejecta material right here, if it's really correctly approximated by nickel. And then we seem to have a repetition maybe here. This is questionable. We don't know yet. But what it really looks like, the KT boundary all over the world is a couple of centimeters in thickness. If you get closer to the Gulf of Mexico, you can have it at a couple of meters, I would say. And here also, right at ground zero, we have stretched the timing of deposition of the ejecta, and we're going to have, in my opinion, a very clear image of what happened right on top of the peak ring with the deposition, the settling of material, including some of the extraterrestrial material coming from the meteorite. So this is extremely interesting to look at. How do we change slides here? Okay. This is, again, I would say, this is X-ray fluorescence mapping. So we're analyzing for Si, iron, and calcium. You see the color is proportional to the concentration. This is the suevite right here. Suevite is interesting because it is what remains in the crater after the impact. The material that remains in the crater, when we compare it with the composition of the crust, the target rock, we can tell what was vaporized, what went into the atmosphere, what affected the climate, what modified the global Earth system. This is what remains in there. After that, you can see here, this is where we suspect we have this ejecta material, somewhere right here. Okay? And then we get to this material right here, and this is more calcium carbonate rich. Okay? This is really interesting because we have here a resolution of 25 micrometers. So we basically scan the core and we get a chemical composition. Yeah, I got the right one. Okay, this is in between, and you see this is pure calcium carbonate. There's no iron, there's no silicon, nothing. This is just pure calcium carbonate. And this is this layer. We hope we hope, keep your finger crossed, that this is deposited right after, that is containing all this really interesting fauna. It may contain some of the chemical anomalies as well, but maybe not. We'll see. And here we get to the second unit. You see it right here. This is iron. Okay, this is also where we have this tiny nickel anomaly, and you see we go from the calcium carbonate in blue back to a lot more, I would say, silicate composition right here before we get back to carbonates up here. So what it looks like is that we really have, at ground zero, the ejecta material, just like all around the world. We can go from Chicxulub, go all around the world, come back to Chicxulub, and track the thickness and the composition, the variability in ejecta. So this is truly unique, and I was very surprised to see that. And that's it, I think.
Yep.
Your turn.
Finish up. Okay, so just the last slide here, just kind of a summary of what we learned, and I'll go from the bottom up. So the peak ring turned out to be made of granite, highly fractured, highly porous granite, representing mid-crustal material brought all the way up to the surface in the matter of a few minutes during the impact, which calibrates the amount of energy release, that 100 million atomic bombs kind of level of energy, and it allows us to understand impacts fundamentally, and all of it is heavily shocked. This is something we published in the science paper here, a shatter cone representing 8 to 10 gigapascals of pressure being experienced by rocks in the peak ring. Above that, we have melt. This is just a nice shot of some carbonate-rich versus silicious-rich melt that's capping the peak ring. Above that, we have these crater materials that stayed in the crater. You can see at the bottom of the pile here, you have chunks of melt. They're all broken up in the suevite. As you move up, you find pieces of the carbonate that was in the target rock. So the fossils in here would be the same age as the dinosaurs, all wrapped up in the crater materials. And above that, we have even finer bits of glass particles and melt-rich material that make up this breccia. And then right on the top of that, as we're transitioning back into the limestones, we have this potential settling layer and this chance for us to see an expanded boundary section at ground zero. So thanks for your attention, and we'll take questions.
Okay, do we have any questions from reporters in the room?
Yeah, I'm Dave Perlman from the San Francisco Chronicle. This is just my ignorance, and I'm trying to figure out how nickel is a substitute for iridium, or what's the relationship there, and how do we know that there's no iridium, or is there iridium in the impact
Well,
area?
nickel is a substitute because it behaves chemically a little bit similarly to platinum group element. So basically, nickel is not that abundant at the surface of the Earth either, okay? And you can use it very nicely to trace platinum group element. We've known that for many, many years. Okay, if you look at KT boundary, it's enriched in nickel, in chromium, as well as in iridium.
And so we now have, in 4 different labs around the world, samples currently being analyzed to see if there is, in fact, iridium. We don't know the answer to that yet.
Yeah, because the iridium layer was presumably Alvarez
Yeah.
discovery, and I don't see why, I still don't understand why you can't find any in the impact crater.
We haven't confirmed it yet.
We haven't found it yet. We're measuring it right now. I said we're using nickel because it's a quick and cheap proxy for the iridium. So basically, you know, iridium, it takes a lot of work. It's also, you know, quite expensive. So if you have to analyze hundreds and hundreds of samples for iridium, I mean, it's almost impossible. So what we always do now is to use a proxy like nickel or chromium to refine where to look. And then instead of analyzing 100 samples, to analyze only 10 or 15.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Irene Klotz with Seeker. Do you have any clues yet as to which or what combination of the various conditions might have led to the loss of life, whether it's the sun blocking or the acid rain or some of these other scenarios that you laid out? And could you maybe just talk a little bit, if it's not too complicated, how you possibly can discern one situation from another? Thanks.
Yeah, so some of those avenues are going to be pursued in the months to come. For instance, we want to look in great detail as to what we think was in the target rocks that is not present in the crater anymore, and ask the question, what got volatilized and put up into the atmosphere? So that's a avenue of research. Another avenue is to look after this question of toxicity. I don't know if you want to say something, Tim, about...
Yeah, we're going to be analyzing a bunch of metals within the settling layer. That obviously is going to take some time, and so we'll be comparing those to the data that Sean's talking about from the rocks that were in the crater before the impact, and comparing them, but also just observing the concentrations within the settling layer, comparing those concentrations to normal marine sediments to see if they're elevated. The other two possible hypotheses, ocean acidification is a really difficult one to get a handle on. It's a very likely culprit because of the amount of CO2 that would have been released by the impact. But the problem with the dilemma that you have with investigating ocean acidification is it dissolves all the evidence that you're primarily looking for. The one thing that we know about it is with the rate of addition of CO2 into the atmosphere, ocean acidification would have been really, really, really rapid. So it's something that we'll be looking for at the base of that silt layer. And then the other one is cessation of photosynthesis. That's another one that we'll be thinking about, and that's something that we'll be working on with the group of us. We'll be working on with Joe and other people who are going to be modeling the impact and thinking about how much material was suspended into the atmosphere.
I mean, a lot of these things become inputs for the next round of models, right? So as we quantify what we can learn from the crater itself, we can then rerun atmospheric models about potential extinction, possibilities with real numbers, not just guesses, because we've now drilled into the crater.
If I may add, I mean, this is the first time we really have the target rock, the carbonates, probably the evaporite, the sulfates that are present in the target rock, the granite below. We have all this in the suevite. We have the blocks. So we can see how they behaved from being part of the sedimentary cover of Yucatan, going maybe up in the air, being moved in all directions, and falling back in the crater. So this will, in my opinion, teach us a lot about the energy, the amount of material that's vaporized, and so on. It's all there. It's available, first time.
Hi, Maddie Stone from Gizmodo here. I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit. You talked about the ecological shifts you've observed in the core so far based on the foraminifera and the nanoplankton, I think it was. I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about what those shifts might be telling us about changing ocean chemistry and conditions in the ocean following the impact, and whether what we find in the crater is more broadly translatable to other parts of the world's oceans.
Well, I can start to talk about that. I think answering that is going to take a while. So just from the preliminary data that we have, we can compare. The main thing that we do is we compare the record within the crater to cores that we've studied outside the crater, and this is one of the best sampled. This is the best sampled mass extinction event. There are many, many, many cores and rock sections on land that have been studied. So, for example, we've worked on a beautiful section that we cored in Tunisia, and that's a place where we have observed after the mass extinction this recovery of life, which is very slow, especially in the calcareous nanoplankton, the phytoplankton group, where we observe these successive blooms, or we call them boom-bust cycles, where one species comes in and dominates the ocean, and then it subsides as another species comes in and dominates the ocean. This goes on for 1 million years or a little bit more after the mass extinction event. So what we're going to be doing in the limestone layers is looking for those bloom species. We've actually already started finding some in our preliminary investigations, and that's in the autotrophic, the phytoplankton group. At the same time, we're going to be looking at zooplankton, the foraminifera, and comparing those successions with elsewhere to try to see if the patterns within the crater are the same. So we're looking for patterns, comparing the patterns within the crater to successions that we've studied in great detail around the world, but we're also going to be trying to investigate the timing of it, and that's going to require a variety of different techniques to try to get a handle on how long it took. And there's a bunch of different techniques I could talk about a little bit about, and the four of us could talk a little bit about. It's going to take quite a bit of time to explain, but we're really going to be looking at timing and the patterns of recovery. There's another group that we're going to try to investigate, and that are the dinoflagellates, which are an autotrophic or a mixotrophic group. They can do both types of production. And we have sent a suite of samples to a specialist in Belgium who's going to be looking at that group. Now, that's a group that, because they encyst, so they make cyst stages, they have a cyst stage in their life cycle, they can tolerate a great deal of stress. And that group doesn't really suffer that much during the mass extinction elsewhere in places like Tunisia. But we're going to be looking for what happened to the dinoflagellates within the crater, because possibly the conditions were different within the crater. And then the other element of that is that that's a group that, since they're autotrophic, it's a possibility is that the foraminifera, the consumers, the heterotrophic group, might have actually been feeding upon the dinoflagellates, and that's one reason why the foraminifera recovery might have been quicker than the phytoplankton recovery. Does that answer your question?
Hi, Sarah Kaplan from the Washington Post. I was hoping you could talk a bit more about the disaster nanoplankton that you found in that settling layer. Is the suggestion that that part of the ocean right above the crater became habitable in the days to years after the impact? And is that a surprising finding? Like what does that mean?
Well, yes, it was something. So when I started looking at these samples, and I should say that I've been studying along with my PhD student Heather Jones at Penn State. I was on the rig. Heather was at the onshore science party. So we've teamed up. And when we started looking at these samples and started finding Burridosphera, we initially said, well, possibly these things were in the Cretaceous sediments around the rim of the crater, and they've just been reworked in. But then as we continued to look, we just found out that their abundance was higher than we expected. And so that's why we started to believe that these things are these disaster taxa. They wouldn't typically be found in the abundances we're finding them. They're still rare, but compared to the other specimens that we're observing in these samples. So we believe they're primary. Now, we know a little bit about Burridosphera since it lives today. And Burridosphera is found today in very unusual environments for phytoplankton. It's found in the Black Sea, which is a very fresh body of water. And so we know from that Burridosphera is able to tolerate stressful environments. So we find it in extremely high abundance right after the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary in places like Tunisia and the deep ocean, sections in the deep ocean. It's also found within the white layer. We find quite a lot of Burridosphera. In fact, on the rig, we started finding Burridosphera a couple million years before we hit the boundary as we drilled down. Thoracosphaera is another little animal. It's a calcareous dinoflagellate, so it's not necessarily, it's included in the nanoplankton because we study them in the same samples, they're the same size, but it is actually, technically speaking, a calcareous dinoflagellate, meaning it's a resting stage. And when you think about resting stage, you think about something that escapes the surface ocean at harsh times. So the best example for that today, even though Thoracosphaera does live today in places like the Japan Sea, it's not really that abundant. It's living in stressful environments today. But the best example of a resting stage is when you think about red tides. Red tides are things that colonize the surface ocean when the environment gets really stressful. But the organism that forms a red tide is actually living in the bottom of the ocean. So its life cycle has a stage that's in the surface and a stage that's in the bottom. And the bottom stage is when it insists, it makes the cyst to escape the surface ocean, and then it floods back into the surface ocean when the conditions get right for it to colonize. So that's what thoracosphere is. We understand the ecology of both of these taxa, and we observe them in the units above the Cretaceous tertiary boundary in extreme abundance. So sometimes they're just the only thing that we find. And in fact, in the white layer, they're pretty well the only thing we find at the very base of that. So they're organisms that are able to tolerate extremely high levels of stress, environmental stress. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm wondering sort of what does that indicate that these two organisms are able to
Well, it says to us that there were other. Well, first of all, we don't know for sure whether we're looking for other taxa. I mean, we have that little guy, Cyclogelosphaera, which we believe is in place, meaning it's from the surface ocean falls down, and our goal is to look for other things that possibly survived the mass extinction. So that's something that we're not able to really comment on at this time, but we'll be talking more about in the months to come. But the abundance of these things tells us that the environment was highly stressful. We're going to be looking for how high up they go into the overlying Paleocene section to see how long the environment stayed stressful, and comparing that duration with the duration of the stress species in other parts of the ocean.
And you can also think various kill mechanisms might have lasted different durations of time. So if something is stressed for a long time, then that might give us a clue as to which kill mechanisms are potentially more important, or definitely a player, whether they're more important or not. They'd have to be present.
Paul Doherty, the Exploratorium. Could you review for me a bit about how you managed to find this great place to drill? What was the evidence? You obviously hit the scientific jackpot here. How did you do it?
So the short answer is you have to image what you want to drill. If you want to go get samples, you have to be able to see your target. And so it was two different sets of geophysical experiments, seismic reflection experiments, that allowed us to image the crater in the subsurface, observe that there was, in fact, an intact peak ring there, and then make a decision of what's the most important rocks to core. And obviously, finding out what a peak ring was answers a huge amount of questions for the planetary science community. It was also the best place to drill, to think about looking for evidence of chemosynthetic life living in a crater after it happens. And because the sediments on top would then be sort of perched and hopefully have less influence of lots of things falling down and maybe causing the record to be incomplete, it seemed like a really good spot to test the recovery of life at the same time. So we were able to make that argument that a single site would be able to hopefully be that jackpot.
And it is.
Howard Lee, freelance. So lately there's been an idea that the Chicxulub impact aggravated the Deccan eruptions. And and of course the Deccan eruptions have been attributed or had attributed to them the idea of ocean acidification, CO2 release, climate change, platinum group elements, and so on. So I wondered if you'd done any dating, precise high-resolution dating, and whether you've got the results of that yet, and what steps you're taking to really precisely locate this impact in time.
Yes, so we are doing a suite of dating. We're doing argon-argon dating and uranium-lead dating. So we've got, I think, 4 different groups doing that in both the US and in the UK. So we're doing exactly that, working out the precise ages. So one of the labs is the same lab that Rennie used in the science paper that you might be talking about. So we'll be comparing directly with those results to get relative dating of everything, yeah. So whether the Chicxulub had anything to do with the Deccan, anything happening at the Deccan, there's no really good reason to believe that's the case. So we would expect the seismic activity does induce volcanic eruptions. So we do know that where there has been a big earthquake, something happens, you get volcanic eruptions release. But to think that the other side of the planet, you could have some giant eruption because of the Chicxulub impact is just not particularly likely. So people who try to model that think you treat the Earth as very homogeneous, and then you can sort of amplify your signal. But actually, the Earth is very heterogeneous, so it decays a lot more quickly than they predict. So it might have caused a minor eruption, but it would not have been of any significance relative to the Chicxulub impact itself.
Okay, I believe we have a question from the web chat, and I think that will be all we have time for.
We have 2 questions from Kelly Beatty at Sky and Telescope. First is for Dr. Morgan. Kelly asks, how long did it take for the target rock to cool down to a temperature where it could sustain life? The second question, what elements within the impactor are considered toxic?
So how long did it take to cool? That very much depends on how the hydrothermal circulation processes. So we see high temperature mineralization actually in the peak ring. So this is something that we will be looking at in detail. So we've got 3 groups looking at that, the duration of the hydrothermal system. If you cool completely by conduction, then it could be a million years, but we think it's going to be much more rapid than that. It could be tens of thousands of years for the peak ring to become habitable. But that is one of our targets. Toxicity. Do you want to?
Of the impactor.
Trace elements that cause toxicity?
Well, I don't think you can do very well in terms of metabolism with a lot of iridium in your system, so that's for sure, but the concentration are so tiny. For the rest, the meteorite is probably, in terms of chemical element, it does not contain any specifically bad chemical element. It's much more than the crust or the mantle. So I don't think that, except for the platinum group element, it's not bringing anything extremely toxic from space. Nothing that you could find on Earth anyway.
Okay, I think that's all the time we have. Thank you all very much, and we'll be reconvening at 2:30 for Defending the Home Planet.